I wanted to share a bit of a story about the New York Times and what drew me to the organisation and its social mission. And it starts back in the 1970s when the organisation was going through a very similar kind of technological upheaval. The old ways of producing and printing the newspaper using movable type and old machines with molten lead were starting to be replaced with fancy new electronic equipment. Jobs were being lost and changed, and there was a lot of upheaval and potential economic threats to the organisation. In the midst of that though, the publisher at the time faced a set of very difficult choices about the organisation's purpose and how much that's at the centre of the work that they do. And I wanted to share with you a letter that shortly after I joined the Times, a colleague of mine found in his drawer. And it's a letter from the Attorney General of the US to the publisher at the time, Punch Sulzberger. And this letter threatens to throw him in jail. You can see from the slide here, it has some fairly scary language: top secret, classification, publication banned by the provisions of the espionage law. What had happened is, of course, in the 1970s, the US was in the middle of a war in Vietnam, and a source for the New York Times had leaked a series of documents that became known as the Pentagon Papers. And these documents were a very long series of analyses of what was going on in the war, and importantly, they painted a very different picture of that situation than the one that was being told officially by the government at the time. The New York Times faced a very difficult choice about whether to publish or not, and in the words of Punch Sulzberger, who was actually interviewed for his own obituary, oddly enough, before he died, he said the entire operation smelled of 20 years to life. Our lawyers were quite cautious, he said. In fact, the senior partner told us that if we chose to publish, his firm would refuse to defend us. The Pentagon Papers, he said, were long, very long, but one thing was undeniable. If I'd been in charge of that mess, I'd have tried to keep it secret too. So Punch says, these are extraordinary documents proving deceit of the people by their elected officials. I had no doubt that the American people had a right to read them, and that we at the Times had an obligation to publish them. So the paper went ahead at this very real risk of loss of liberty and the economic value of the organisation, and published the Pentagon Papers over a series of weeks. And of course, as per the threat from the Attorney General, who very helpfully explained that this was in breach of several laws, this wound its way up to the Supreme Court eventually to decide on whether the freedom of the press or the espionage laws were the more important considerations. And the New York Times fought this all the way to the Supreme Court and won ultimately in a 6-3 victory that's known as the United States of America versus the New York Times. So the New York Times won that case and established freedoms for the press and for journalism that previously had been more ambiguous. So history continued to unfold. The Nixon administration continued to get itself into further trouble. And a few years later, of course, Nixon became the first president to resign while in office under threat of impeachment. So fast forward now another 46 or so years, and we're facing very similar threats and a very similar relationship between the press and, in this case, the White House, powerful officials in the land. We face similar technological disruptions where new forms of media and production are replacing and undermining some of the economic basis for the organisation's business. But we're starting to see how this upswell of support and backing for the mission of the organisation is really leading people to flock to it as consumers and as subscribers in unprecedented numbers. And the organisation itself has been learning to tell its own story, to explain why the work that it does is so important. These are some images from Daniel Burluck, who won a Pulitzer Prize just the other year for his photojournalism around the Ebola epidemic in Africa, of course. And it's not just about war zones and Ebola hotspots, but this is some reporting by the Times about just the lives of ordinary shift workers working at Starbucks and the challenges that they face in just making ends meet when their scheduling is difficult to predict. And in fact, a lot of this reporting had real impact on the way that organisations, in this case like Starbucks, do treat their workforce. The organisation's learned that it needs to lead with this story about the truth and why its work is important, and that messaging And that focus has really been successful in driving renewed interest and driving renewed success of the business model.